After the formation of the Revenue Marine Service in 1790, it took several years for the Revenue Marine to gain success in enforcing the tariff and other laws along the coasts, especially since the Revenue Marine was the only maritime force of the United States until 1798, when the Navy was reorganized after being disbanded following the Revolutionary War. The first documented incident of the Revenue Marine Service enforcing federal law along American coastlines is represented in this painting dating back to 1793, in which Revenue Marine officials are shown seizing gold that was brought ashore by a French privateer, or essentially a pirate. This painting, among others, is very significant in the history of the United States Revenue Marine because it is one of the first records we have of the execution of one of the primary missions of the modern Coast Guard, to protect our nation's coasts by enforcing federal safety and security laws. The Revenue Marine continued in this role until 1798, when the Quasi-War with France began following the XYZ affair. At this point, the technology and importance of the Revenue Marine began to change as the Revenue Marine became involved in wartime. This famous painting of one of the first revenue cutters, the USS Massachusetts, shows what early Revenue Marine vessels would have looked like, and also gives insight on the primitive technology of the Revenue Marine. Most cutters prior to the invention of the steamboat were propelled by sails, as was the case with the Massachusetts. However, as the Revenue Marine grew and expanded towards the end of the 18th century, the quality and quantity of the vessels gradually increased, especially after an act of Congress was passed in 1799 that allowed the President to commission and maintain the necessary amount of revenue cutters to defend America's coasts. Also, the emergence of the Quasi-War established an important practice that has continued into the era of the modern Coast Guard. During the Quasi-War, the Revenue Marine assisted the newly formed Navy to help maximize maritime armed forces and to improve national defense and security. Once the Quasi-War ended, the Revenue Marine transitioned back to the Department of the Treasury and resorted to its original mission of federal law enforcement and piracy prevention. This is very similar to what happens today in today's modern Coast Guard, in that the Coast Guard remains part of the Department of Homeland Security during peacetime and transitions to the Department of Defense, or the Navy, during wartime. After the Quasi-War with France, the Revenue Marine's role in national security and law enforcement became heightened following the Revolution of 1800 and the consequent election of Thomas Jefferson. Under Jefferson's administration, the Revenue Marine was still required to enforce tariffs and prevent piracy, but national defense also became part of its duties in addition to the Navy due to British ship impressments that would ultimately lead to the War of 1812. Perhaps the most daunting responsibility given to the Revenue Marine during this time period was the enforcement of Jefferson's unpopular and controversial embargo of 1807. Revenue cutters were often assigned to certain ports along the United States East Coast and would ensure that no European goods made it through the ports and into the United States. Also, the revenue cutters were instructed to prevent unauthorized trade ships from exiting the United States waters as a result of the embargo. The Revenue Marine's role in national defense would continue to increase during James Madison's presidency as a result of the impending War of 1812.